So if nothing else, we are on message here. If you did not detect it, as this last crime bill's perspective showed, we do have a moment of unity around many areas of criminal justice reform. So we're going to close out our day today, diving deep to try to understand that moment of unity. And we're hearing from a bipartisan panel who are going to talk about how everyone is pulling in the same direction. And so to help us with that and to help us really understand is Jesse Wegman of the New York Times editorial board, who will discuss with our guests where they see the most potential for reform. So welcome and thank you very much for being here.
Thank you all for being here. I was going to call this the Dogs and Cats panel, which is from a quote given by one of the funders of the Coalition on Public Safety, which has been mentioned several times today. But I realized that it's only dogs, or it's only cats here. It's getting increasingly hard to find people who disagree in substantive ways on these issues. And I mean, we know their names, we hear them all the time, but it's an increasingly small number of people. So I'd like to introduce the four of you and then ask you to talk about that dynamic and how it might affect the prospects for reform going forward. To my immediate right is Will Ruger, who is the Vice President of Research and Policy at the Charles Koch Institute and the author of numerous books, articles, and op-eds. To his right is Norman Reimer, who is the Executive Director of the National Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers and is himself a veteran defense lawyer. Michael Mitchell is a policy analyst on state fiscal policy at the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities. And Vikrant Reddy coordinates the Right on Crime campaign and is also a senior policy analyst at the Texas Public Policy Foundation Center for Effective Justice. Vikrant, I wanted to maybe start with you to talk about something you've said a few times, which is that to the extent that there is a divide, it's generational more than it is partisan. And you mentioned when we were speaking before that there are a lot of young people right now running for president who could very well shape the way these issues are discussed over the next 18 months in particular. Could you say more about that?
Sure. I think the first thing we should all do is realize that the people who are voicing objections are voicing not crazy objections. I mean, they're coming from a very reasonable place. So we'll just say the names: Chuck Grassley in the Senate, also Dianne Feinstein. I think previously when Bill Keller and Senator Booker up here, they talked about Chuck Schumer. It's worth noting that these people probably remember an America that was riddled with this urban crime epidemic. New York City was considered completely ungovernable, and things like, I don't know, the Bernie Getz incident or the Willie Horton ad, all these things are very, very fresh on their mind, and that was real. I mean, there are people who say that, I don't know, President Nixon's war on drugs was fear-mongering, this kind of thing. I don't think it was fear-mongering. I mean, this was a real concern in the United States. And they remember those days, and it's valid to remember that. On the other hand, there are a lot younger people. Senator Booker was just here. Mike Lee, I think the folks heard from today. I'm from Texas, Ted Cruz. All of these figures, they're in their 40s. And they don't really remember those environments. They're crafting policy for a different age. And as I said, many of those people are running for president now, or at least in 6 years. And I think they may be in a position to kind of shape the dialogue in a way that the older generation of senators is less so.
Will, can you talk a little bit about why Koch Industries has been interested in this area for quite some time now?
Sure. I mean, I don't want to speak for Koch Industries so much as for the Charles Koch
Apologies.
Institute.
The Institute.
Sure, I'm happy to do that. I mean, I think it's a natural one for us, given that our views are oftentimes informed by the classical liberal philosophy, which emphasizes the importance of individual liberty. We also have an important focus on the types of policies that impact the kind of moral dignity of the individual. And that's really critical in this area. A criminal justice system that's broken isn't respecting that moral dignity, and that's critical. It also relates to our emphasis on well-being. So it's really important for both individuals and society that we have a criminal justice system that protects people's property, broadly understood to include bodily integrity, but that also doesn't go so far as to limit opportunities for people. And Norm's done great work on collateral consequences. You want to punish the crime, particularly those serious violent crimes, personal and property, but you don't want to go so far as to diminish the opportunity for people ahead. And so those collateral consequences that affect people are really diminishing both their individual well-being and society's well-being. It creates a real problem. And the New York Times did a great article on this about a week ago, talking about some of these cases, and they're heart-wrenching. People that really want to do the right thing, get a job, go out there and be productive members of society, and yet they're not able to because of some of these collateral consequences.
One of the initiatives that has gotten more attention recently has been the provision of funding for indigent defense, training and support services. Can you talk about, I'm going to use this as a way to segue into Norm as well, but talk about why that particular area was chosen of all the various things you can do in this area.
Yeah, I mean, we're interested in a number of things in this area, and I liked what Senator Booker talked about the whole range of things from the front end to the back end. But I think really that front end is critical, because it would be much better for both individuals and society if we could prevent people from getting into the system in the first place. And part of that is people doing the right things and not committing crimes, but the other part of that is that when they're in the system, or when they're potentially in the system, that they have proper representation, as is consistent with Sixth Amendment jurisprudence. And that's really important. That's what's great about some of the work Norm is doing in helping make sure that happens, to keep people out of that system so that they don't have a criminal record, and then they have to check the box in a lot of places and therefore can't get the opportunities that will help them and their families and their communities.
Norm, can you pick it up from there? You're the person here with the longest experience on the ground, I think, as a defense lawyer, and talk about how those considerations that, from your experience, play into this.
Well, the first thing, and to pick up on something that Will said, is to remember that we talk about numbers, we talk about our mass incarceration problem, but really what we're talking about is human lives, the dignity of the individual, the possibility of redemption, the opportunity that every single person should have. So that's what I think, what you're referring to is what I bring to it. I spent 28 years standing alongside people from every walk of life in local courts, in federal courts, and were with them at really the lowest point in their lives. And the job is to give these people an opportunity. And what we've been hearing about all day is how we've snuffed that out. Now, my view is this. We are a society that right now, as represented by this great array of folks up here and all these people who are on the videos and that participated today, we are a society that is itself about to get off an addiction. And that addiction has been an obsession with the criminal justice system as a tool to regulate all kinds of social, personal, and economic behavior. And we are just now beginning to see this vast movement of recognizing that we have a system that's out of control, over-criminalized in every way, shape, or form. We put too many people into the system for no good reason. We put them there for too long, and then we leave them branded for the rest of their lives. So I've covered a lot of territory there. But the fact of the matter is that we have got to limit the use of the criminal law to those things that are classically bad and pose a danger to society. We've got to stop using it to regulate personal behavior or economic behavior. And when we do put them in, as someone else said, we've got to put them in for shorter periods of time, because we know that there are diminishing returns. And most importantly of all, we have to tackle the problem of collateral consequences in this country. Now, that's a big mouthful. You heard somebody earlier describe that the ABA's inventory that found that they found now, I think, 50,000. We have branded people with a disability that is a terrible roadblock. And I'll just close my segment here with a couple of illustrations of what we did. We had this task force that held hearings around the country. Listen to some of these stories and think about what we are doing to people. A mother of 4 who was dismissed from a bank job because of a shoplifting charge that had been dismissed. Another woman who couldn't, because of a conviction that was 15 years old, was not allowed to attend her child's school, to see the child in a school play. A 75-year-old man thrown out of public housing for a single act of public urination, and a decorated war veteran who was a legal resident of this country, really never knew any other country, deported because of a single misdemeanor conviction. We have to be willing to step up and come around to the idea that once a person has paid the debt, whatever the debt is in the criminal context, they have to be given an absolutely equal opportunity to move forward in life.
Okay. Michael, I wanted to move this also into the realm of concrete policy opportunities. And you wrote, in this paper that you wrote for the Center last fall, you highlighted the link between funding for education, or lack thereof, and funding for criminal justice. And that in many states they're inversely correlated. The more money that's spent on incarcerating people and on criminal justice, the worse off they do educationally, and vice versa. Can you talk a little bit about, I mean, we've measured the impact of our 30 or 40 year experiment in mass incarceration in many different ways today, but would you talk about it in the terms that you described in that paper, specifically just the sheer amount of money that has essentially been diverted toward greater incarceration and away from some of these other areas?
Sure. So first, it might be a good idea to get some context, right? Because states are really in uncharted territory when we're talking about where their revenue systems are right now. In 2010, if you had looked at the cumulative shortfalls that states were facing in terms of the amount of tax dollars that they were taking in versus what they wanted to invest in their budgets, you had a shortfall of about $190 billion. If you had looked back at the dot-com recession, and you would have had to have the 2002, 2003, and 2004 shortfalls added together to even kind of get close to that amount of money being lost. And so states had a question to answer, right? How are they going to make up the difference? And a lot of states decided that they were going to cut investments to higher education. They were going to cut investments from K through 12 classes, social services, and other kinds of investments that work to address a lot of the issues that we've talked about today. One of the areas where you didn't see as much of that divestment was corrections budgets. Currently in 2013, states are spending, the state by itself, this isn't local dollars and this isn't federal dollars, more than $47 billion in their corrections budgets. That's up, if you adjust for inflation, that's up more than $28 billion than they were even 25, 30 years ago. At the same time, in higher ed, states are spending about $2,000 less per student. 30 states are still spending less today than they were on classrooms K through 12 spending before the recession. And you don't work at a place called the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities without questioning, if this is what we're doing in our budgets, what are priorities that lawmakers are kind of acting on today?
You're saying that if states were spending at the level that they spent 30 years ago on criminal justice, they'd have $28 billion
That's right.
more dollars.
$28 billion that we could be using to invest in mental health and drug abuse services, $28 billion more that we could be using to make sure kids are getting into college instead of ending up in prison, $28 billion more that we could be using to make sure that all-day pre-K for children, which is another issue that a lot of people across the spectrum are really energized about. So there is both a lot of the things that Norm and Will have talked about in terms of hurting the family and hurting the individual from one standpoint, but there's all this kind of lost opportunity to invest in things that could really make a difference, especially in communities that have really been impacted.
Great. Vikrant, you talked about being from Texas, and I want to hear more about Texas. I think everyone should hear more about Texas. It's been a remarkable success story in many areas. The most uncharitable way of talking about it is that they had a lot to work with, but a lot of states have a lot to work with and have not done anything like what Texas has done in terms of reducing prison sizes, in terms of increasing drug treatment programs, in terms of reducing recidivism, and closing prisons themselves. Can you talk more about what has succeeded there and what lessons that might provide for the rest of the country?
Sure. Let me just tell the story. The story starts more or less in 2007 when you have this organization in Texas, the Legislative Budget Board, which is kind of an internal think tank for our state legislature. They had told the legislators that because Texas was growing leaps and bounds and things were going so well economically and so many people kept moving in, you would necessarily have to continue expanding the prison space. They said by the year 2012, you're going to need another 17,000 prison beds. It's going to cost $2 billion. Now here's where the great Texas ethos kind of kicked in, because the legislators said, well, now we're not particularly interested in spending all of this money. We don't want to go back to our constituents and raise taxes. At that time, we actually had a budget surplus. This is an important point because a lot of people think that this is being done because of post-2008 economic crash concerns. But at the time we had a surplus, they said, we're not going to spend all of that money either. We need to find some way to handle this problem and not construct all of this extra prison space. What ideas are there? And so they started going to different think tanks, and they determined that probably the best thing that you could do is spend just a fraction of the money and put it towards things like better community supervision monitoring, better drug courts, and things that really focus on treating people outside of prison bars. And the thing that's so notable about this is that the price difference is just a chasm. I mean, in Texas, the cost of putting somebody in prison for a day is $50, and the cost of having somebody on probation for a day is $2. So you could really, ratchet up the level of the services, help people not spend all the money, and find that down the line you actually had a more efficient system, which is what the Texans were so concerned about. So, of course, it's great theory. The question is, did it actually work? And the answer is that it did, because once 2012 rolled around, not only were those prison beds not needed, Texas actually shut down a prison located just outside of Houston in Sugar Land in 2011. And then 2 years later, they shut down 2 more. And so, this is the ultimate red state, the ultimate tough on crime, hang 'em high state. This was Rick Perry who was signing all these budgets and pieces of legislation. These were very strong conservative members who were advancing these bills. Even the Democrat who was part of the bipartisan consensus here would not be considered a Democrat in most states in this country. Senator Whitmire's a pretty conservative guy. And Texas was able to kind of establish itself as the role model. And what's really neat about that is, through my work with Right on Crime, I'm able to go to other states. I can go to Mississippi, which passed a major bill last year. I can go to Utah and Alabama, which are looking at big pieces of legislation this year. And I can say, hello, I'm not from Vermont, I'm from Texas, and I have some ideas. And everybody's willing to listen, because nobody thinks that Texas is a soft on crime state.
How did it play on the ground there with the citizens?
It plays well. I think that we're starting to see, I think Senator Booker got this question, and I really liked his answer. It seems like everybody at this point knows somebody personally who has been caught up in this system. You say, well, my neighbor's kid, he's a great kid. I used to drive him to school, but he developed this drug problem in the 11th grade. Or, oh, my nephew, he's such a great kid, but such and such happened. And so we're at a point now where so many people feel personally connected to the issue that I think that when you make the argument that incarceration may not be the best solution, it's still a problem, and people still have to be held accountable, and we still have to do something about this, but perhaps drug courts, perhaps treatment, perhaps these kinds of solutions are better. People on the ground are willing to listen.
And I think that brings it back around to something I was going to ask Will to expand on as well, which is what Norm was talking about regarding collateral consequences. I think people may not realize, those people, that shrinking pool of people who don't know somebody who's either been incarcerated or has a criminal record, may not realize just how many people are affected by this. I think the number I saw recently was 60 or 65 million Americans have a criminal record. I mean, that's an astonishing number. And that means that 60 to 65 million Americans are facing some level of collateral consequences. Can you talk a little bit more about where might be the soft spots there, where get the most bang for our buck and make the most changes, reduce those consequences for the largest number of people?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to start with by saying, look, I don't think any of us are talking about a situation where we don't want those kind of old-fashioned common law serious crimes to go unpunished. And I think that's a message we need to get across, is that it's not soft on crime. And that's what I like about the right on crime notion, is it's not that they're trying to be tough or soft, it's they're trying to get it right. And you hear people talk about smarter sentencing and things like that, and I think that's where we need to go. The problem, again, is that too many of the people that are facing these collateral consequences, or they're the subject of overcrim, is that they're engaged in behaviors that aren't part of these traditional common law crimes, and yet they're being punished in severe ways. So there's an instance recently where someone was given 55 years in jail for selling $300 worth of marijuana. And at the same time, we have cases where people convicted of much more serious crimes, the kind of crimes that we want people to go to jail for, are getting things like 13 years. In one case, someone who was convicted of rape was given 13 years, and you have someone who was selling marijuana getting 55. And I think we don't need to talk about whether we should have crimes against these types of consensual behaviors to see that there's a real problem there in terms of the disproportionate sentencing for these very different types of behaviors. Now, as far as the question about collateral consequences, I mean, one thing to do would be to have a situation where there's greater hope for redemption. And I think that that is something that appeals to a lot of people in the kind of country that we are, where, particularly the kind of country that where many people have a Christian faith that believes in the power of redemption, even if people are sinners. And I think it would be really important that we kind of take them up on that and say, look, if we go to a system where there is the hope for coming back, becoming a productive member of society, even if you've done your time, it means that you're an ex-felon, as Norm taught me. You're not a felon at that point, you're an ex-felon, and that person needs to be redeemed, and we need to give them the opportunity to show that redemption was something that we ought to have given them the chance to earn. So things like, it's not just government actions, it's also private actions.
You talked about licensing.
Well, there's government actions in terms of whether people are able to get occupational licenses. Now, I'm opposed to occupational licenses for all kinds of things that we shouldn't have. Floral designers or interior designers. I'm not sure why they have to be licensed in the first place. But even leaving that aside, the question is whether nonviolent criminals, or people with felonies, but that are not part of these kind of traditional common law crimes, whether they ought to be barred from working in these areas. I mean, it seems to be that that would be an easy place, a kind of piece of low-hanging fruit that we could allow these people to redeem themselves in. And then also, I think like I said, private businesses need to take a chance, and it's hard to get them to do that. So I was at the National Black Chamber of Commerce meeting last year, and people were very excited about the possibility of changing the rules on this. But you really need businesses to step up, because it's not just a government act. You have to have people willing to say, look, I could run the background check right away and then not hire people that have a criminal record. You have to have people willing to take that risk. And I think these guys are probably better suited to tell you how we could shape that legal environment to make sure that that risk isn't going to fall back on these businesses. But the fact is that we need both private and public actions.
And to bring this back to concrete policy experimentation, I think Will's point is well taken, that we are distinguishing between I think more traditional crimes that people don't question the need for harsher punishment, and then this other area of crimes that I think has really expanded our prison population in recent years. But I want to talk about what happened even with regard to that first category of crimes in 2012 in California, which was Proposition 36, and what the results have been. So Will, would you just talk? I'm sorry, Mike, would you just talk about what Proposition, for those who don't know what Proposition 36 is, explain what it was, right, and what the last 3 years have wrought.
Yeah, so actually there's two really important pieces that we want to talk about. Is Proposition 36, which looked at California's infamous 3 strikes law, and basically said your third strike, if it's a certain type of offense, you can't be you won't basically face the kind of draconian penalties that have been implemented in the past under the third strike. And it was not only looking forward, but it's also retroactive. So if you had a certain offense that led you to put you in jail or prison, you could actually apply to have that reviewed and released. In a similar vein, Proposition 47 kind of reclassified a lot of felonies to misdemeanors, which would have an effect of moving people from prison into jail, or if that sentence, was completed, you could be released. And that was also retroactive. So those were two very kind of forward-thinking pieces of reform out in California. And over the past few years, thousands of people have been either have been able to be diverted out of prison altogether, or have been able to be released. And I believe even from Proposition 47, that just went in place, you're looking at about 2,000 people that have been able to get out of prison so far. But the exciting thing, especially about Proposition 47, was this mechanism that was put in place where they said, look, letting people out of prison is going to save us money. And it's high time that we take those dollars and we, on an annual basis, we calculate what we're saving, and let's put those into things that will actually help on the front end. So we're putting more dollars into substance abuse and mental health treatment. They're going to put more dollars into kind of at-risk youth, so truancy programs, and helping kids stay in school, and then also dollars into victim services. And this is actually pretty novel for the states in terms of having it very codified in the sense that, on an annual basis, the California Department of Finance is going to calculate what they're saving. That money gets put into a protected fund, and those dollars, based on a formula, get pushed down to kind of these local reforms. And we're really excited to see that states are moving in this way of taking those dollars and putting it into the reinvestments that can actually make a difference, and not necessarily into kind of beefing up the corrections and the policing aspect of the corrections system.
One interesting thing I remember from at least the Proposition 36 was that an overwhelming majority of, this was a ballot initiative, and an overwhelming majority of voters who were polled on it anyway said that they had voted for not for fiscal reasons, but for basic reasons of human fairness. Mm-hmm. And that was a striking thing that, I mean, usually when you have ballot initiatives, you're not letting people out of prison early, Mm-hmm. and so I wonder if you feel like that signaled some, or any of you want to address the extent to which that signaled some sort of change in the mood of the country about what it means to incarcerate people for extremely long periods of time.
I mean, I think it's similar to what other folks have said on the panel, is that, one, a whole lot of people know someone who has had some sort of interaction with the criminal justice system in some way, shape, or form. And so when it's not someone else in some other community that you're thinking is being locked up, it changes how you're going to feel about these things. And then the second piece of it is that it's not sustainable, is that you just cannot continue to lock up so many people in so many different ways and restrict their opportunity and expect things to function the way that they're supposed to. And I think people are starting to see that.
Norm, you were going to say something on that?
Well, just in terms of the changing viewpoint of the country, I mean, you were right. I think the number is 65, almost 70 million now who have criminal records. We arrest, according to the FBI, I think the 2012 statistics, 14 million people a year get arrested. And of course, the statistic, which I think is what drives this whole conference that everybody is aware of, is the 2.2 to 2.4 million people in jail. And frankly, I think the country is now getting to the point where it's embarrassed that we lead the world in incarcerating, that both per capita and actual numbers. How can the United States of America do such a thing? We are not fundamentally a nation of bad people. We're not a nation of criminals. So I think that's what's happening. And I want to make a point about something else that is taking place, and that in the absence of some of these ballot initiatives has to take place. And that is the rebirth of the concept of clemency and pardons and commutation. Unfortunately, even as we start to change the laws, we've relaxed some of the drug sentencing a little bit already. We may do it again if we're lucky and Senator Grassley changes his mind. But the general jurisprudence in this country is that that's not retroactive. So we have, in our federal prisons alone, thousands of people who, if they were sentenced today, would get a lower sentence because of the current charging policies, the current sentencing laws. So to give you an illustration of the strength of the feeling out there that we need to do something, many of you may have heard of the administration's initiative to seek to identify people nonviolent people, nonviolent past, present, while they're in jail, who would have gotten lesser sentences, and to try to commute those sentences. That's been a commitment from this administration. So I'm fortunate to be working with a number of other groups, including Families Against Mandatory Minimums, the ABA, the ACLU, and our organization, on a thing called Clemency Project 2014. And many people don't know this, but it's a program designed to make sure that any inmate who might qualify has the benefit of a free, qualified lawyer. And we have over 1,000 lawyers have volunteered for this project already, including 55 law firms, small and solo practitioners. So there is a wellspring of sentiment out there that we need to help to reverse the legacy of this '94 Act and other such measures.
I want to open it up for some questions in a moment. I just wanted to ask any of you on the panel to come back to something Will said earlier regarding low-hanging fruit. And I think an initiative like Prop 36 really demonstrates how even a minor change in state law can have remarkable and measurable impacts that people can see, oh, this isn't as bad as we had been told it might be. What are the, I'm wondering if there are other areas of low-hanging fruit that any of you want to identify that could maybe propel this, the reform movement forward a little faster, as people can see, oh, when we make these small changes, they actually have meaningful impacts. You had mentioned asset forfeiture is one.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a growing realization that civil asset forfeiture is just an abomination. I mean, this is just a terrible situation, particularly given our tradition in terms of people being considered innocent until proven guilty, in terms of our respect for property rights that I think that this country is founded upon and that still respects. I mean, it's egregious. And another thing I think that people are starting to realize is that the militarization of policing is not really healthy for the feelings of security in our communities. And I think that's something that we need to move on, because we've talked about both front and back end, and that's really at the front end. We can't have situations where people don't think of the police as members of that community that protect and serve them, but that instead are seen as the other. That's a recipe for all kinds of, like I said, those feelings of insecurity, but also that kind of rising sentiment of disgust at government when government is supposed to be acting. For any of us along the philosophical or political spectrum, government should be protecting and securing our communities and our property, and now people are feeling disgust at some of that. And I think part of it is that this is not necessarily a problem with police officers being bad people. Part of it is the incentives that they have. And so we need to change those incentives. And I think those should be low-hanging fruit because these are transpartisan issues. And I think that it's the right thing to do. And I'm confident that this is a country that, yeah, we have our problems and we have bumps on the road, but eventually we get around to doing the right thing, particularly when it's not a political issue, but it's a philosophical one.
Any ones the others of you would identify?
So this is not a kind of public low-hanging fruit, but for legislators in the states, I think fiscal note reform is actually something that makes a lot of sense.
Can you explain what that is?
Sure. So whenever there's some kind of proposal or some kind of law that a lawmaker puts forward in a state, in many instances, they will produce a fiscal note, which just tells you how much this is going to cost you on a year-to-year basis looking ahead. The only problem is when you look at kind of the criminal justice world and any of the proposals that are put out by lawmakers, very rarely is a fiscal note produced. So if we're talking on the front end, when we're putting in place all of these laws that are going to raise up your prison population, there was never a moment where a lawmaker saw that, we're going to put X number of people behind bars and it's going to cost us this many more millions over the next 15 to 10 years. And now on the flip side, when we're talking about reforms, there's never a document that gets put in front of them that says we're going to be able to release, X number of people, it's going to save the state this amount of money, and we're going to be able to invest it in these areas.
Why is that? Why no? No more transparency on the fiscal front.
So there is no good answer. I mean, a lot of these things are practices that just have never been looked at, and in some instances, this lack of transparency gives lawmakers a lot of a lot of ability to kind of sell it how they want to sell it. So, so from that standpoint of not having it in place in the past, it's kind of just been inertia that's kept us there. But I think that's an area where a lot of folks could kind of get energized in certain circles and kind of bring to light that there's an opportunity here.
The whole history of criminalization is about legislators not at all thinking that there's any price tag. It seems so easy. Oh, something happened. Let's make it a crime, or let's make the penalty that much stiffer. So I think you're right. I think forcing the self-discipline to ask the question. And one other thing which actually has happened in terms of our federal over-criminalization, which is when the House convened at the beginning of the current session, finally, we did a report several years ago with Heritage on the lack of intent in criminal statutes, you know, because they're coming from all different committees. People don't necessarily know how to write a criminal law so that it's properly drafted, so that you don't sweep up people that you don't intend to sweep up. And so the House now has a rule that will give the Judiciary Committee, which is the committee that should look at new crimes, the right to consider that bill before it proceeds. So that's a little tiny step, but it could help slow the spigot.
And the counterpoint to what Mike's talking about is what Vikrant said earlier regarding Texas lawmakers blanching when they saw the impending cost. So, I mean, it sounds like it's not always impossible to impress upon legislators how much this is going to cost, and that it can have a meaningful effect.
But you have to tell them, as
Right.
Mike points out, you know, if they don't know, and they all too often don't know because there's just not enough transparency in that process.
Well, one other thing I think, and I'm not sure it's low-hanging fruit, but it's really important that we haven't talked about, is having a stricter mens rea or intent requirement. And that's something on the front end. I mean, with all of the laws that we have now that Norm was talking about, how many of us actually know all these? You know, there's what, 4,500 federal criminal, about 5,000 criminal laws, and about hundreds of thousands of criminal regulations. How could we possibly know this? So having a stricter intent requirement, I think, would be one way to help solve some of the problems that's been created by overcriminalization. When
I get up in the morning, I read the Federal Register just to stay on top of the regulatory crimes.
That's why we like you so much.
I'd like to open it up to any questions. We've covered a lot of ground here. Sir, right here in the front.
Hi, I'm Galen Carey with the National Association of Evangelicals, who are working on these issues as well. It's encouraging to hear about prisons being closed, and I hope that continues. I guess it raises a question, aren't the prison bureaucracies or the prison unions or so on, or maybe the communities where the workers live, opposed to this kind of thing? Are we going to have the same kind of issues as we have with surplus military bases, where there's all this opposition that gets into the way? Also, prosecutors who use these draconian sentences as leverage for getting plea bargains, and aren't they also going to be opposed? Or where else would we see opposition to these, what seem to be common sense ideas that you all have been talking about?
It's a great question, and there's a somewhat entertaining answer that comes from Texas. You know, we put so many of our prison facilities out in rural Texas where people don't actually live. People live in Dallas and Houston and San Antonio and Austin. But these prison facilities are all the way out in West Texas or in East Texas. And as the questioner pointed out, so often these communities depend on these prison facilities because everybody works there. It's very, very difficult to close them down. Now, recently in Texas, there has been this extraordinary shale boom. We've been doing all of this fracking. And all of a sudden, people who are working as prison guards found that they could make more money working out on an oil rig. So the solution in Texas, the way we were able to close these 3 prisons down, was drill, baby, drill. And that actually helped quite a bit. And I know that's not going to work everywhere. It is a very difficult problem, you're right, and not every state is going to be like Texas and North Dakota and be in a position, to use that kind of a solution. But that is one thing that has worked for us in the last few years.
Ma'am, over here on the left.
Hi, my name's Julie Stewart. I'm the president of Families Against Mandatory Minimums, and this has been a great forum for the morning, and there have been a lot of impressive speakers, but I feel like there's a couple of things that have not been discussed. And one of them is that the mandatory sentences that have driven the crime wave, or the incarceration wave that's happened for the last 25 or 30 years, were really passed in 1984 and 1986 with the crime bills. The 1994 crime bill actually had one small sentencing reform in it, which I would argue is probably the first bipartisan sentencing reform since 1970, when Nixon signed the Boggs Act repeal. And this sentencing reform was a safety valve that allowed drug offenders only to be able to benefit from it if they meet certain criteria, and the judge could then sentence below the mandatory minimum. And that has affected about 25% of the drug offenders going into federal prison every year, which is about 100,000 people to date, which means they're still going to prison, but they're going to prison for shorter periods of time. But I think that's an example almost of a low-hanging fruit at that time. But I would argue that today, in fact, and I know this is the policy panel, the Smarter Sentencing Act, which is bipartisan in the Senate and the House, has a provision in it to expand the safety valve to Category 2, so people with minor priors can also benefit from it, as well as other pieces of that bill that are great. So it also, back to assessment of cost, would save, according to the Department of Justice, $24 billion over 20 years. So those are the kinds of messages that need to get to the members of Congress daily. And then I do have a question, and it's for you, Vikrant. I should have been on one of these panels, Nick. Sorry. But my question is, Texas has this amazing story, which you have told here very well, but you don't have mandatory minimum sentences. So could what happened in Texas have happened had you had mandatory minimum sentences?
Yeah, well, the first thing I'll say is Julie definitely should have been on a panel. She's great. But the second thing I will say is, yeah, I think that's a really important point. The legislators did terrific things in 2007, but they had the ability to. You know, we sometimes pick on California and say, well, how come you didn't do what Texas did? But in fairness, California had hemmed itself in. It wasn't able to do those kinds of things. The judges had laws that they were obligated to follow. So these mandatory minimums have been insidious in so many ways. And I think what people have to realize, well, let me step back. And I was saying my very first response today was we have to understand that some of these laws were passed for legitimate reasons. Mandatory minimums also had kind of a reasonable theory behind them. And actually, it was a left-wing idea. The idea was a young black boy and a young white boy go in front of a judge, and at the end of the day, for some reason, the young black boy gets a much larger sentence than the young white boy does. So why don't we just standardize the sentences for everybody? Seemed like a reasonable idea, but I think most people who were making those arguments back then would now say we probably got that one wrong. And the reason they got it wrong is because these mandatory minimums set into play this really perverse incentive in politics. Because one guy can come along and say, you know how I'm tough on crime, that mandatory minimum of 2 years, I would raise it to 4. And then the next guy can come along and say, that 4-year mandatory, I can raise it to 6. And it's just an endless upward ratchet.
Do we have more questions? I had one for all the panelists I'd be interested in your take on, which is, you know, it's been brought up several times today that there was, you know, the crime wave, the increased crime rates of the late 60s into the 70s and 80s were an unquestionable driver of a lot of the policies which then turned into what we have today. Let's say we have another crime wave of that magnitude or smaller, but nevertheless significant in the next decade. How do we stop? How do we not make the same mistakes we made this time?
Well, I'll start by saying that there was a comment was made earlier that we didn't invent the crime wave. I actually think we did invent the crime wave. It's basically our substance abuse policies which drove most of that crime. And frankly, I think the likelihood that we'll see another crime wave is inverse to whether or not we will continue to pursue those kinds of policies. We are not fundamentally bad people. There are going to be some people who commit violent acts, who steal, but it takes an active society to drive what took place in the 60s and the 70s and 80s. And we have to fix that. And I think we are seeing the beginning of that change. I think it's going to be, over the next 5 to 10 years, I think that this country is going to come to the realization that the approach that we've taken with alcohol is probably a better approach than what we did during Prohibition, and that's the way we have to address it.
So Norm rejects the premise. Any of the rest of you?
You know, when I look at that, before even the idea of the crime wave, I'm taking a similar path, is that we have significant underlying issues that really need to be addressed. I mean, segregation is still a very large issue for a lot of communities. I mean, African Americans are still largely segregated from economic opportunity, from a lot of other communities, and there's just really it creates a lot of the issue that we then decide to handle through our corrections and criminal justice policies. So I think before that issue ever comes up, we need to start tackling all of these other kind of side pieces, well, the main problems that will help actually reduce some of that potential problem.
Do you want to speak on that?
Well, I think sort of like Norm, I reject the premise, but that's never a fair answer. I guess one thing I would say is, and there's no way to prove this, but I read a really interesting idea. A lot of people have this idea. I think I first read it from James Q. Wilson about what caused the crime spike in the 1960s. And he has argued that just this kind of general cultural unrest, this unleashing of if it feels good, do it kinds of forces, was very, very counterproductive. And that probably had a lot to do with sparking the crime epidemic in the United States. And the things that we did, to a certain degree, were useful in stopping crime, but very, very quickly went much too far, started casting too broad a net, and weren't focused on what the problem was, which is this kind of these cultural forces. So I guess I would hope that if there is some way to ever validate whether or not that is in fact what happened, that we would learn those lessons and realize that you shouldn't go too far whenever you're clamping down on what might be a short-term sociological problem.
Will, any last words?
Yeah, I mean, there's just a lot of research showing how in a lot of areas, particularly with crime, things are just getting better every year, and so we're not living in as dangerous a world. And while I wouldn't predict the future, that's always a dangerous sport, things look like they're going in the right direction, and it's these types of reforms that will impact that. So in some respects, I agree with Norm that we can affect the rate of crime in some regards, not obviously all the way to zero given human nature, but we can affect that rate through the types of policies we have.
Great. I want you to join me in thanking the panel for doing great.